Okay, I cannot control it. As you sit down, please raise your hands if you need. We have a simultaneous interpreter because this will be all English. Someone gonna interpret to the Korean. If you need it, please raise your hand. And then our youth pastor Untek will come to you, deliver that machine. You see, I'm like a puppet. Okay. 네, 여기 만약에 우리 한국어 번역이 필요하신 분들은 여기 우리 정은태 전도사님께서 기계를 가지고 있으니까 가지고 바랍니다. 손 들어주시고 받으세요. 그 기계가 몇 개가 있는지 모르지만 아마 필요하신 분들 돌아가겠습니다. If you found or lost anything, lost found, will tell us. There's people here waiting for you to respond. So, okay. Okay. It's time 7 o'clock. We'd like to keep it on time. So, wow. Thank you for coming, and thank you. Okay. Okay, now we're going to start this actual the lecture of real content of our symposium, and I hope you enjoyed the wonderful dinner. And now let's go into more brain work. So let's do that. So today we're gonna our church, the Korean Church of Boston's children's ministry director. Yewon Park Chandu-san will come up, introduce our plenary speaker today.
Well, good evening, everyone. We believe and hope that you had a really great dinner at our church with a warm welcoming as well by all of us. Well, thank you so much. I really love it too. So I'm Yewon, who is in charge of the children's ministry as director / 전도사님 as well. And I had a task to introduce our first plenary speaker right over here, Dr. Soojin Chung. So let me read her bio here. Soojin Chung is director of the Overseas Ministry Study Center and teaches in the Department of History and Ecumenics at Princeton Theological Seminary. She is editor of the International Bulletin of Mission Research and the convener of the Princeton World Christianity Conference, Gerald H. Anderson Lectures. She previously served as an associate professor in the School of Theology and director of general education under the office of the provost at Azusa Pacific University. She was the principal investigator of the Hispanic Serving Institution grant funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and Vocation Academy grant funded by the Council of Independent Colleges and Lilly Endowment. Dr. Chung is the author of Adopting for God, The Mission to Change America Through Transnational Adoption, New York University Press in 2021, and has published articles and book chapters in various journals and edited volumes. Her current book project explores racism, ethnocentrism, and xenophobia in world Christianity. She is on American Society of Missiology Board of Directors and the editorial board for the Journal of Faith in the Academic Profession and William B. Erdman's Publishing's History Collection. She received her BA from the University of Virginia, Master of Divinity from Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, and PhD in World Christianity from Boston University. Of course, yes. And from 2017 to 2018, she was a visiting scholar at the UC Berkeley Department of Ethnic Studies. Let us welcome her with a big round of applause. Thank you.
everyone hear me? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for having me in this prestigious symposium. I honestly did not expect this many people, so I am a little nervous. But I want to especially thank Dr. David Cho for the invitation, Reverend Lee and Reverend Yoon, and all the pastoral staff, all the elders, and all the volunteers. I know how much it goes into organizing a conference. I do that every year, so I appreciate everyone who was involved in the process. And I'm also excited to serve alongside my good colleague and friends, Dr. Roger Nam and Dr. David Chow. David Chow right there, who are also my good friends, and I really look forward to your lectures. I am really excited that you invited the three of us, the historian, theologian, and a biblical scholar, to present on the past and present and future of the Korean American Church. So my task as a historian is to unearth hidden stories of the first wave of Korean migrants and to show how their struggles and mistakes and small and big victories can teach us about our present and hopefully the future. And as a historian, and I'm sure Grace would know, I was taught to never predict the future, so I will leave the task to Dr. Nam. All right, so let's go to the first slide. Okay, so that is a picture of me from 3 years ago, 4 years ago or something like that. It was during the pandemic. So that was me going through a drive-through naturalization ceremony. So I became a US citizen during the pandemic, and because of that, instead of going to a 3-hour ceremony, I did a drive-through 10-minute ceremony, which was great. And I didn't have to hear all the boring stuff. But before my naturalization, and even now, I always regarded myself as a Korean and a bridge builder between two different cultures. So that was why I was always fascinated by different aspects of cultures and different aspects of Christianity, which made me go to Boston University to study with Dana Robert, which is one of the pioneers of the field of world Christianity. So for those of you who are not familiar with the field of world Christianity, it began around 1980, and it has its roots in mission studies and ecumenism. And currently it is understood to mean history and current form of Christianity in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Oceania, the Caribbean, basically all over the world. So that is how we understand the field of world Christianity. So as mentioned, I am trained as a historian of world Christianity, but my research and teaching cross various disciplinary boundaries. So for example, my first book, Adopting for God, is cross-listed under Asian American Studies, Religious Studies, ethnic studies, etc., etc. So when I was studying my PhD, I realized that ethnic studies and religious studies, and particularly world Christianity, actually has a lot of similarities and shared roots. But I also noticed that they were rarely in conversation with one another when I went to Berkeley as a visiting scholar. So both world Christianity scholarship and ethnic studies try to decenter the Eurocentric narrative and to bring forth the indigenous voices within Christianity. So the intersection between Christianity, nationalism, and race has always been my interest, and in particular, I'm interested in the connection between Christianity and Korean nationalism during the Japanese colonial era because of these two existential questions. And we're going to have a little bit of discussion time because I like to be interactive and I don't want to be talking for the entire 1 hour. So my first question is, why are Koreans so good at finding each other in foreign lands? So whenever you go to a foreign country like Venezuela or Peru or wherever, you hear Korean language and your ears immediately perk up, right? Have you experienced that? And you want to just talk to them. You are just so drawn to Koreans because you just magically congregate with one another. And whenever you whenever you move to a new place, you always find each other. And wherever Koreans are, there is good education system, right? Because Koreans are so good at finding each other. So phrased differently, why do Koreans have such a strong sense of kinship and sense of belonging? So I want you to find a partner, and if you're sitting by yourself, you can turn around. I want you to find one person and I want you to discuss why you think this is the case. So let's have about 2-3 minutes and then we'll come back together. Let's come back to the big group. And because I am such a teacher, I am going to cold call if there's no volunteers. So any volunteers who want to share, 1 or 2 people? Okay, I'm just going to cold call. Yes. You basically summarized my lecture. Thank you. One more person. Okay, I'm going to cold call. Oh, please.
And we use very unique language of Korean. So I'm so happy to see someone speaking in Korean, and I just, want to say hi if I travel abroad.
Yes, thank you. There's something very special about the language, right? And we're actually going to talk a lot about language. So thank you. Actually, those are really 2 really important insights. And the second question that guided this research, and don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to talk about this. Why are Koreans so racially insensitive? And yes, I understand that I am making a very general statement. And before I get protests from you, I understand that we all have our blind spots and none of us is perfect, right? But I can safely say, as a Korean myself, that Koreans tend to be a little bit racially insensitive. And the reason why I say that is because I was serving as a pastor to Southeast Asian immigrants in Dongdaemun. So I was there for a couple of years serving that crowd. I experienced a lot of racism from my fellow Koreans. And I started to ask this question. And I also experienced a lot of racism from my fellow Koreans, sometimes including myself, when I was serving as a pastoral intern at Park Street Church at the International Students Ministry. So that naturally led me to ask, why are we so racially insensitive? And where did we get this idea of racial hierarchy? Where did it originate from? So those 2 questions, although it may seem unrelated, are the reason why I decided to do a research on Korean nationalism and Japanese imperialism. So in today's talk, Next slide, please. I will examine Japanese. So our parts are going to be two parts. The first part is going to be Japan, and there's a reason for that. In order for us to understand why Koreans were reacting that way, we have to understand Japanese occupation of Korea and Japanese understanding of Christianity. So that first part examines Western racial imperial order's influence on Japanese understanding of race and how they use Christianity to justify Japanese imperialism. And part two is Koreans' response, how Korean Christians in response use their Korean Christian faith to come up with a very unique theology of belonging and justice and agency. So this talk uniquely examines how the racial order created normative standard of modernity and civilization for both the colonizer, which is Japan, and the colonized, which is Korea. So let's look at the next slide. So we're going to go to part one, Japan. So as you may know, next slide. As you may know, Japanese imperialism is largely divided into two different periods. The first is Meiji period. You probably heard of Meiji Yushin, right? So that is the first period, and then the late imperial era. So the reason I broke it into these two different parts, I don't think this is working. Okay, the reason I divided is their understanding of race during Meiji and late imperial era actually changed significantly. So Meiji in Korean is 명치. It literally means enlightened rule, right? 명 as in 밝을 명 and 치 as in 다스릴 치. So it literally means enlightened ruled. And the Meiji marked the inauguration of Japan's passage into modernity, upon which the Meiji government promoted rapid modernization to garner international recognition. So what is really interesting is Japan drew heavily from European models of government, medicine, education system, etc., etc. So even the Meiji Constitution, which is the first modern constitution, was modeled after the Constitution of Perugia from 1850, or back then, Germany. So during the Reformation, Japanese government hired foreign officials like from the UK, Germany, France, the United States, and these officials came to Japan and taught agriculture, education, medicine, but they didn't just bring these skills, they also brought two really important things. The first thing is Christianity, and the second thing is racial order, the Western racial order. So with the period coinciding with the height of European imperialism and accommodation of Western Christian racial imperial order, Japanese rulers very much welcomed this racial system and human differences. Next slide. So for Japan, as you can see from this graph, they already had a system, a feudal system of classifying people and classifying and having a human hierarchy, right? So for them, having a human hierarchy was not a challenge. It was like, okay, we already have classification system, so what is your classification system? But what was incompatible with them, however, was the fact that yellow race was inferior to the white race because there are multiple views of how they view racial order and evolution, but some people believe that yellow, blacks, Native Americans were not descendant from Adam. So there were people who actually believed that. So that view was completely incompatible with the Japanese because Japanese had their own god, their Shintoistic god deity, Amaterasu, who was the one who gave divine authority, not just to the emperor, but to the Japanese people themselves. So if they are the divinely chosen people, how are they inferior to the so-called white race according to this new religion called Christianity? So that was completely incompatible. However, as these Japanese intellectuals wrestled with the problem of modernization, they came to accept the fact that they have to somewhat receive Christianity in order to achieve full modernization. So that started to happen, especially with the missionaries' active support to bring these Christian language to the government, and that led to the removal of the centuries-old official edict against Christianity in 1873. So perhaps one of the most well-known Japanese Christian during the Meiji time is Nitobe Inazo, who is also in the 5,000 yen, as you can see. He is very much beloved, and not just in Japan, but also in the Western world. He was a Quaker, and he wrote a very famous book called Bushido, The Soul of Japan. So he's really popular in the States because of that book. And in this book, Bushido, which is an ethical code of samurai class, he's trying to argue that this ethical code of samurai is very similar to the New Testament ethics. So he drew a parallel between Bushido samurai ethics and New Testament ethics. And he said, we are actually closer to the white Christians than Taiwanese or Chinese or Koreans because we're spiritual kins to these white Western Christians. So they use this notion of civilizational whitening based on their shared virtues in Christianity and privileges of empire. So I thought that was really fascinating, that how he identified Japanese closer to the white race rather than with other race. Next slide. As both a scholar and colonial policy, so he was also a Christian, but he was also a colonial administrator in Taiwan. And I don't know if he was joking, I can't really tell in his writings, but he was saying that Taiwan is like a white elephant instead of a golden goose, because we wanted more powerful nations, we wanted better lands, but we got Taiwan because we couldn't get anything else. So that's literally his words. And referring to Korea, he said, we Japanese are appointed to rule over Korea. We're divinely appointed because, in his words, quote, young Korea is yet capable of governing itself, end quote. So as you can see, he's demonstrated a very crusading optimism and imperialism that is also reflective of the missionaries at that time. So his subscription to racial order was most evident in his 1912 article, Japan as a Colonizer. So in this article, he is marveling at two successes of the Japanese. He's saying that we successfully got rid of robbery and opium smoking. So he's saying this is all thanks to the Japanese colonial officers who are really courageous men. So he is also very much betraying his hyper-masculine understanding of Christianity based on the Bushido samurai ethics of manhood. Next slide. He lamented, however, that there are still two obstacles remaining. The first, listen to this is where it gets fascinating. The first obstacle to the colonization is mosquito, and second obstacle is right here, the savage of Formosa, in his own words. So referring to them as savages, who are the aborigines of Formosa, or Taiwan, who descended from the Malay race. But he said, but don't worry, we found a brilliant solution, which is to confine them with barbed wires around their inhabitants and confine them at the top of the mountain. Mind you, this is coming from one of the most beloved Christian writer known to the United States. So remaining optimistic that the tribe after tribe will recognize that Japan's power and submit to its authority, he ended the article by asking the Americans to congratulate Japanese for being an amazing colonizer. Next slide. So we're going to a second period, which is the late imperial era. So we're moved on from Meiji to now the late imperial era, which is marked by Pan-Asianism and supremacy of Japanese minjuku. So Pan-Asianism, you've probably heard of this term. This is a time where you move on from the blanket assumption and blanket endorsement of Western racial order to reappropriation and saying, oh, actually, I don't like your Western model. I'm going to come up with my own model, and that model is going to center around the Yamato race, the superiority of Yamato or pure Japanese-blooded people. So during the Pan-Asianism, the central premises of Pan-Asianism is that East Asians are related in our blood, our vision, our purpose, our future. So we should collaborate together and fight against the white race. And early Pan-Asianist writings actually employ the slogan of same culture, same race. So this is not intrinsically imperialistic or uniquely Japanese, But ever since the Japanese government started to endorse this policy, Pan-Asianism shifted from East Asian brotherhood and sisterhood to basically putting the Yamato race at the apex of the racial hierarchy. So this Pan-Asianism became a very much a language for Japanese superior race. Next slide. So one of the most notable thing in this Pan-Asianist writings is that they often employed the word jinshu, which in Korean is injong, to refer to race during the early writings in their Pan-Asianism. But after the Japanese imperialism started, they increasingly shifted to minzoku, which is minjok in Korean. So this was actually a very strategic move because in order to manage all your colonial subject, you needed a language to unify them and mobilize them, right? So they came up with this brilliant notion that we are ethnically related and we share a bloodline. So they came up with, you are our minzoku, therefore you should help our expansion efforts. So the Japanese government started to mobilize these colonial subjects who are minzoku for their wartime efforts. Next slide. So you would think that Christians would think that's alarming and shift away from that rhetoric, but that wasn't the case. There was a lot of Christians who actually endorsed this language of minzoku. Ebina Danjo is one of the most prominent one who fused Shintoism and Pan-Asianism and Christianity and have a very Shintoistic understanding of Christianity. And he merged Shinto beliefs with Christian logos and said Japanization is actually the divine will. And this is where I think is really fascinating. He began to say that Japanese people are actually best equipped to evangelize Koreans because of their in-between status. They said, look, we're closer to the white people because we are Christians and we are morally superior, so we're like the white people, but at the same time, we look like Koreans. So they say, oh, Koreans are going to relate to us more. So we're in this in-between status, and God has appointed us Japanese to evangelize and bring civilization to Korea. Next slide. His mentee, Watase Tsuneyoshi, that's not a picture of Watase, that's actually Kojong, as you probably know his face, wearing a very Western clothes. So referring to Kojong's abdication in 1907, Watase actually said, you should celebrate. Koreans should celebrate because Kojong's abdication was a divine will, and Koreans who are protesting against that is going against God's will. And he was also the director of Nihon Kumiai Kyokai, or the Japan mission to Korea. And he set up a mission station in 1911, and he was very, very proactive on evangelizing Koreans and trying to bring civilization to Korean population. Next slide. So by 1930, and this is not, I'm not talking about these folks as a minority Christians. By 1930, most Japanese churches, not minority, most Japanese churches formed some theological language to justify and support Japanese military expansionism. And that kind of climaxed when Kyodan, or Neo-Kiristoto Kyodan, was established in 1941. Kyodan was a combination of 34 denominations and the largest Protestant church in Japan. And it was basically a puppet. It did everything that the government told it to do. It supported war efforts. It used church buildings to actually garner people to make weapons. It was just everything in the cloaked and Christian language. They supported everything that the Japanese military government was telling them to do. So let's go to the next slide. I promise it's going to get hopeful. I know it's really depressing, but next slide. So let's move on to Korea's story. So how did Koreans respond to all of these flood of information? So when Korea was annexed, next slide please, by Japan in 1910, Korea, as someone at the back mentioned, very much so, we were sandwiched between two imperial powers, right? Japan was the colonizer, Korea the colonized, and the US competing imperial power. So sandwiched between these two empires, we had two choices. well, two options, actually three options. The first option is to accept Japanese form of Christianity, Japanese imperialistic form of Christianity. Second option was to accept the passive assimilistic form of Christianity supported by the missionaries. Or the third option was to come up with their own theology. And they opted for the third option, which is where it gets hopeful. So even though missionaries were vowed to be neutral in their political affairs and did not meddle with Japanese government, they still aligned with Japanese colonial rule so that they can have a voice and they can still be missionaries in Korea. And some even actually supported Japanese, saying that they're actually doing good work because they're bringing civilization. So in this very, very depressing and bleak spiritual landscape, Koreans, as I said, opted for the third option of crafting their own unique theology of suffering, belonging, and agency, which is going to be the meat of my talk. But at the same time, they didn't do everything right. When they appropriate the word minjok from minzoku, they also very similarly illustrated and demonstrated this Western racial order. So as you probably all know, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, Korean historiography divides Japanese occupation of Korea into three different periods, right? Military rule, cultural rule, and ethnocide or ethnic genocide. So during this, especially the latter half of the period, Japanese systematically erased Koreans' name. They changed the name locations. Koreans were not allowed to have press. So it was literally an ethnocide, getting rid of genocide of one's ethnicity. Next slide. So one particular example, there are so many examples of how Christians merged their faith with the political act, but this is just one really simple example of how Koreans were very active in the independence movement. So out of the 33 signers of the Korean Declaration of Independence, 16 were Christians. That's almost half. And 2 were Buddhists and 15 were Cheonggyudo. So you have to understand that there were only 1% Protestant population back then. So considering that fact, that is a very impressive statistics. Korean nationalists had a very distinct theology of suffering and freely used persecution tropes. So if you look at the left side, a call to prayer, that's a prayer letter issued in March 1919. And the golden text of that prayer letter was Esther, where Esther famously says, "If I perish, I perish." So when Esther went to the king, she knew that she might die, right? If I perish, I will gladly perish. That was a kind of attitude these Korean Christians had because they understood this as a divine mission appointed by God to fight for the freedom of their country. So they believe if I die in this independent fight, freedom fight, I will die gladly in participating in the suffering of Christ. And if you look at the other one where it says 만세 반석 this way, this is the famous hymnal Rock of Ages, right? So we're actually going to meditate. It's really hard to read that original Korean Hangul, but so I'm going to ask you to listen to the song. Feel free to do whatever posture you want to do. You can close your eyes, or you can listen to the lyrics. You can read the lyrics, but we're going to play 만세 반석, and I want you to imagine yourself being present in Korea during the year 1919. So imagine yourself as a Korean Christian during that time singing this hymnal. What is going on in your mind? What kind of emotions are you experiencing? So let's go back in time. Let's go back to 1919 and listen to 만세 반석 together.
장애
This song always makes me a little teary because it was my grandma's favorite, one of her favorite hymnals before she passed. So what were some of the things that you would notice about this hymnal? There's obviously the notion of suffering and passion of Christ, right? So that is a very obvious reason why this was so beloved by our Korean freedom fighters. But there's actually a second reason. Can anyone guess why? I'll give you a hint. March 1st movement. 만세, right? On March 1st movement, 3.1운동, what was a phrase that people shouted? 대한독립 만세, right? That way around Korean, and they shouted 만세, 만세. And that phrase actually became outlawed by the Japanese. So the fact that they were singing this was a very active and intentional act of subversion. They were intentionally protesting and shouting to God to save them, and that was their way of fighting against Japanese colonization. They fully knew that they could be tortured and killed because they are, I don't even know how many times manse is in the hymnal. It's a lot. It's like almost 10 times. They're gonna get tortured because of those 10 times. But they still resisted, and they still praise a song, praising God and praising the glory of Jesus Christ. Next slide. So obviously, Japanese government started to see a very close relationship between Christianity and these independence fighters. So because of that, they started to kill and torture Korean freedom fighters in a very barbarous way, namely using crosses. So just like Jesus Christ, these freedom fighters were hung on the cross, tortured, and died. So in this Christian Herald that was published, a newspaper from 1919, it says, the Christian church in Korea has become the center of a barbarous persecution. Christians have been made to bear crosses in mockery of their religion, while the name of Christ has been subjected to infamy. So next slide. So one of the main contribution of these freedom fighters is this notion of self-determination. So whenever I say the word self-determination, everyone automatically thinks this person, Woodrow Wilson, right? It's so funny because Woodrow Wilson actually never used the word self-determination in his 14 points speech, but the month later he actually did use that word. And in a presidential address to Congress, he said, quote, national aspirations must be respected. People may now be dominated and governed only by their own consent. Self-determination is not a mere phrase. It is an imperative principle of action. So let's go to the next slide and let's look at the Declaration of Independence. So although they don't use the word self-determination, let me just read the first sentence. This is a Korean independence of Declaration of Independence. We Koreans hereby declare that Korea is an independent state, and then Koreans are a self-governing people. I'm not gonna read everything, but the notion of self-determination is permeating through this document. Next slide. But what a lot of people, a lot of historians overlook is the fact that self-determination and self-governing, self-supporting, self-propagating, that concept goes way back before Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. It actually goes all the way back to 1890 when John Nevius brought the three-self church, or the Nevius plan, or the Nevius model to Korea. So this Nevius model of church planting was basically missionaries saying all the Korean churches must have three principles of self, which is self. I'm sorry, I think I lost the microphone. Okay, self-support, self-government, and self-propagation. So leaders like An Chang-ho and later Seo Jae-pil as well very enthusiastically adopted the three-self model, and they started to apply this covenantal relationship between God and his people and the three-self church model to the constitutional relationship of the Korean nation state. And this is a photo of some missionaries. Missionaries, particularly a lot of US missionaries, prohibited political activities of these Korean Christian fighters, Christian independence fighters. For example, in 1906, in a Pyongyang academy, after they participated in a rally, a lot of students were suspended because of their participation, although it was a very peaceful protest. And during the Pyongyang revival in 1907, where we all know the Pyongyang revival, right? So in that session, there were multiple cries of liberation and asking for God, please save us, have mercy on us. And these missionaries pressed upon Koreans to be ashamed for their unforgiveness, heart of unforgiveness towards Japanese. And they said, whatever anti-Japanese sentiment that you have is ungodly, so you should repent. So despite this general apathy of and not all missionaries were like that. There were a couple of missionaries who were actually fighting for and helping these Korean independence fighters, but majority of the missionaries were very apathetic. Despite these apathetic attitude of missionaries, Koreans were at the forefront of crafting their own contextual theology of liberation. So eventually, as you all know, Japanese became very violent at some point, right? So at some point, they just started to not care about the international image. So they started to kill, torture people in a very brutal way. And finally, only after that, the missionary said, no neutrality for brutality. Okay, so when we go to this slide, Korean diaspora communities, so Korean Americans and first wave of migrants in particular, negotiated their identity by aligning themselves with the American population. So if we look at this newspaper article, this is a article published in 1919, I think, and it's an advertisement called American Korean Victory Fund Drive. And it says, help raise the right flag. If you want to lower the flag of the hated conqueror, which is the Japanese, and raise the dead of old Korea, help us put the American Korean Victory Fund Drive. Every cent raised during the drive will be sent directly to President Roosevelt to use as he sees fit. And in the archive, that emphasis was from the original archive. So, so if you look at this photo, you can see the background, which is the American flag, and Korean flag is at the front. So there's the visuals speak a lot, right? And if you do psychology of advertisement, that was a very strategic move. They intentionally used those two images to promote Korea, US, we're friends. We're trying to be your friends, we're alliances. So they were using a very smart strategic way to align with Americans. And another example is the open letter. Next slide, please. Open letter written by Korean women to American women. So on the left, you see an open letter. So this is very much in sync with women's work for women theology, where women believe that we should socially uplift other women in other parts of the world, and we should basically help each other based on this notion of sisterhood. And on the right side, you see a letter written to President Wilson by school-aged girls. You probably can't read that because it's so small, but let me just read you one part. And this is written by people who are like 15, 16-year-old. And they say, quote, in so much as the members of the Paris Peace Conference are giving attention to correct principles and the rights of all men, we girls have been shamefully treated and have suffered much disgrace, which is true because oftentimes, you know the history, they were raped and sexually abused. So they keep on saying, but whom can we cry to redress our wrongs? Where can we go for help? We have no power, no men to go to, but we believe in God that he may move you to hear us, Mr. Wilson, President of great America. We look on you as a father. Hear our Declaration of Independence and tell it to the world is our prayer. So you can easily see the paternalism going on, right? You were looking up to the United States as a father figure. You were asking them for help. This is very much reflecting the missionary paternalism, where the missionary said, I'm the father, and you younger churches are the children, so you have to follow us. So we see that similar theme going on very much so in all of these documents of Koreans trying to align themselves with the US empire. Next slide. So nationalist leaders like Seo Jae-pil and Lee Seung-man were very active in Korean diaspora community, and Boston, as you probably know, was the place where they did a lot of their independence activity as well. So the Korean Congress invited prominent Protestant leaders, and they established the Korean Congress in Philadelphia, not too far away, and they also made, there was actually a Boston chapter as well. You can continuously see this theme of liberation, belonging, and a sense of agency for Korean diaspora communities, even away from the homeland in Korea. Even, just think about it, they didn't technically have to fight because they still have safety compared to their, the Korean counterparts living in the homeland, but they were still very much motivated by this home away from home, long distance nationalism. Next slide. Okay, so now we're moving on to my second question. This begs us a question: how did Korean intellectuals respond to the Meiji discourse around the superiority of Japanese race? And where on earth did Koreans inherit this notion of racial hierarchy? So I'm going to answer my second question. So it is noteworthy, and on the left you see Yoo Gi-jun with his very famous Seo Gyeonmun, and on the right we see Yoon Ji-ho. So it is noteworthy that while Korean nationalists championed Korean independence and self-determination, they nevertheless operated within this Western Christian imperial order, and they fully embraced social Darwinism and this notion of civilization, or in Korean, 문명. And social Darwinism in particular was the first ism to be imported to Korea. So so Yoon Ji-ho and Yoo Gi-jun was actually at the forefront of promoting the social Darwinism, and they came up with words like 생존 경쟁, which is survival for the fittest. And Yoon and Yoo, like many other Western missionaries, fused social Darwinism with Christianity and came up with this notion of national progress and survival. Next slide. So this is going to be a little triggering, a little hard. But Yoon Ji-ho, while he was studying at Vanderbilt at Emory, he saw a lot of injustice, obviously, done by white Christians to Native Americans, black population. So he was initially a little puzzled. He said, I thought Christians were supposed to love God and love people, love others. But why are these white Christians claiming themselves as Christians, but treating these Native Americans and African Americans in such a horrible manner? And he found an answer in social Darwinism. And in a quote from a Yoon Ji-ho diary, or Yoon Ji-ho ilgi, he says, on the surface, there is something very cruel to hear a Christian talk so calmly about extermination of a weak people by a strong one, and that too often by means of treachery and injustice on the part of the so-called Christian and civilized people. Yet, however our sentiments may be against such wickedness, facts are facts, referring to social Darwinism. The doctrine of the survival of the fittest can never hold true among the individuals of the same race or nation, but certainly it is true among different nation or races. So he found an answer, and Yoon further argued that fully embracing the social Darwinism, that the United States is indeed better off by the right ruling class, and he repeatedly called the Native Americans as the Reds, as Yoo Gi-jun also does. So let's go to the next slide. So this is also really important because when he is also responsible for establishing Anglo-Korean school. So this you can even tell from the name, right? Anglo-Korean school was it was modeled after the Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute. Tuskegee Institute, as you probably know, was established by Booker T. Washington. And many of you may or may not know, but he was all about promoting this notion of racial uplift and racial progress. So Whether intentionally or not, by endorsing this economic upward mobility, he was suggesting that African Americans accommodate to whites' demand for racial segregation. And there were a lot of people who criticized this viewpoints. Obviously, for one, W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out that Booker T. Washington never actually supported political equality. He was all about just upward mobility and racial uplifting. So he said that is actually not the right way to do, because you're still putting the blacks under the rubric of progress if you keep on doing that. In the very same way, Anglo-Korean school promoted the same value of racial uplift. They taught Koreans the textile, how to make textile for exportation, and they said, if you do this work hard enough, and this is part of the reason why Korean Protestants are so good at work ethics. We're so good at working because this notion of industrialism and this hard-working labor was instituted very early on in the early history of Korean Protestantism. So in this way, Yoon and American missionaries together, because missionaries were also working with Yoon Chio, they conceptualized this notion of racial progress and racial uplift. So Yoo Gil-jun went one step further, and he very similarly, like Yoon Chio, referred Native Americans as the Reds. And this is his own words, that he predicted that the African Americans are going to go extinct because they are so inferior, both spiritually, morally, and physically. So Yu's racial hierarchy bears striking similarity to Fukuzawa Yukichi, who was one of the most important Meiji leaders, and which is not a surprise because he studied at the university that Fukuzawa founded. So he came up with this 4 category of race: fully enlightened, which are the white folks; half enlightened, which are Asians; pre-enlightened, and the so-called savage at the bottom. So this is he very much articulates this in Seoyu Gyeonmun, in his very famous book Seoyu Gyeonmun, and he was also mentored by Edward Morse, who was the pioneer of social Darwinist theory and Spencerian theory in Japan. So it is no surprise that this racial categorization was crafted by him. But this is not just the end of the theory. This theory of racial category became the norm in Korea after this was introduced. So, surprise, surprise, this notion of racial hierarchy was originated from the West. And Korean Christians, very much like the Meiji leaders, uncritically accepted this Christian racial order. Next slide. Korean Christians' triangular agency between 2 empires of Japan and the US became profoundly shaped when they started to reappropriate minjok from the Japanese language of minzoku. So as we just examined, minzoku had a very specific purpose, right? But minjok also has a very specific purpose, because at the beginning, there were Koreans who were part of Pan-Asianist movement. So during that time, minjok was obviously used to denote this brotherhood amongst East Asians, right? But after the Japanese annexation of Korea in 1910, they started to use minjok to mean exclusively Korean, people of Korea. And this is also the time where people like Seo Jae-pil, An Chang-woo, and Yoon Chio and Yoo Gi-jun as well started to say, we minjok, we Korean minjok have to be together and build this sense of belonging and kinship so that we can survive in sandwich between these 2 empires. And even Seo Jae-pil and An Chang-woo also often inferred blacks and Native Americans and other Southeast Asians as inferior races. So even you can see that these very famous Korean independence fighters that we look up to, our heroes are not perfect. They were still very much influenced by Western racial order. So next slide. So what does that teach us about our present? What can we learn from the history? So let's talk about the positive aspect. The first glaring thing is that our ancestors crafted a model for us. They crafted a theology of suffering, belonging, and agency. So They didn't opt for the Japanese imperial Christianity. They didn't opt for missionary passive Christianity, but they opted for the third option, which is making their own theology and their own form of resistance. So in that way, that is really encouraging because they already created a model for us, and that should motivate us that our ancestors forged a contextual theology. Next slide. Okay, some of you may think, why do we even need Korean American theology? Why do we need a unique Korean theology? I thought Christ's love transcends all ethnicities and bounds, and race doesn't matter in God's kingdom. And this is where the field of world Christianity can be of help, because the field of world Christianity always deals with this tension of universality or unity of Christianity and particularity or the diversity of Christianity. So if you look at God, the Godhead, the God's self is unified because we believe that God is one, right? But at the same time, if we look at our triune God, they're manifested in three different forms. There's diversity, right? So even within God's self, there's unity and diversity. And Lama Sane argued for the famous principle of translatability, right? Oh, sorry. Oh, I'll just move on. So translatability of the gospel, which is that the gospel is literally and metaphorically translatable in different languages. So the word contextualization, I keep on using that word over and over again, it literally means to weave two things together. So we have the unity, which is the unchanging nature of kerygma, although people's interpretation of the Word of God is very, very diverse. And then we have the changing and diverse nature, constantly evolving cultures, right? So finding that sweet spot is the art of contextualization. So having a unique contextual theology in that sense is not a luxury, it is actually a necessity if we look at a triune God who is both full of unity and diversity. So next slide. So that was a positive part, but the negative part is that even our ancestors were still very much subjected to Western hegemony and racial order, as they function within the framework provided by Western constitutionalism, Wilsonian logic, and missionary education, and most importantly for a conversation, social Darwinism. Korean diaspora communities in particular negotiated their identity by aligning themselves to the US empire. And this is where it's so funny. Both Japanese and Christians said, look, I'm not like one of them. Like Koreans said, I'm not like those Japanese. So when Japanese were getting turned to internment camps, they said, I'm a Korean, I'm not Japanese. Japanese also said, I'm not a Korean or Chinese. I am your spiritual kin. I am civilized. I am modernized. So you see both ethnicities actually wanting to be identified closer to the white race. Next slide. So United States, as you can see from this graph, although imperfect, I would argue that compared to the Jim Crow law days, we have progressed, right? Although if you look at the news, it's a little doubtful if things are going the right way. But the reason is, compared to 21, it is projected that by 2050, majority of the population will be Asian, Black, and Hispanic. So white will, for the first time, become the minority. And because the United States became so diverse over the years, the Americans were kind of forced to deal with this notion of diversity and inclusivity. However, if you look at Korea, we inherited this racial order from the United States, and not just the United States, but the Western world in general, in early 1900s. But we largely remained monolithic, right? And as I was pastoring at that church in Dongdaemun, honestly, frankly speaking, Koreans are not ready to welcome these flood of Southeast Asian immigrants as neighbors or even as human beings. That's what I learned from my time, because we're not ready. And the reason is because we remain largely monolithic. We didn't have a chance to craft a sense of inclusivity and to really see our brothers and sisters as fellow human beings. And same thing with our grandparents. When they immigrated, as many of you know, post-1965 Hart-Celler Act, a lot of the immigrants were struggling to survive, right? So they were struggling to survive in a laundry shop, in a nail salon. I don't know about your grandparents, but my grandparents were very racist because they were so busy trying to survive in this foreign land. And they didn't have yoyu, or room in your heart, to care about anything else but the survival of their own family, which is totally understandable. But at the same time, we cannot remain in the past, as we've seen in the graph that I showed you with the United States. If we're going to be more and more diverse, and if we are truly or to reflect a diverse God who loves all races, things have to change. So I'm going to end with a positive note. So I'm going to read this quote from C.S. Song, who is one of my favorite theologians. He says, "Tell us our names, not such names as Charles or Helen. Tell us whether you know something about Moti or Gautama Buddha, and not always about Plato or Aristotle. Tell us if you know our history and what it means for us, and not always about your own history and what it must also mean for us. And tell us whether you see and understand the struggles that have been going on for centuries in our body, heart, and spirit, and not just unburden your concerns for our lost soul." So this is aimed at the Western Christians who are trying to impose their name, giving them American names like Helen or Jacob or whatever. So that my name is Soojin, and that's actually very intentional. I intentionally kept my Korean name because I have a very traumatic experience of going to a ski camp when I was not speaking any English, and they said, "So what's your name?" And I said, "It's Soojin." So I didn't know how to speak Korean, so I said Soojin in a very Korean pronunciation. It's Soojin. They asked me, "What?" like multiple times. And I said, "Soojin, Soojin," like multiple times. And they said, "Oh, I can't understand what she's saying. Let's just call her Sue." So for the entire week, they called me Sue. And you might think this is a cute little episode of like an 11-year-old, but that memory stuck with me. And when my parents asked me, "Do you want to change your name?" they said, "Heck no, I'm keeping my name because it represents who I am. I want them to tell me my name and my struggles and my story." So I want us to remember that Koreans are strong people. One of the things that I didn't mention when I was going through this archival documents was that Korean mothers in Korean diaspora community, especially in California and Hawaii, they held their newborn babies and their children on their back with the obuba position. They went around each door knocking, selling kimchi and tteok and reprints of Korean Declaration of Independence, and asking their American neighbors to support and to pray for them. That's strength. We wake up at 5 in the morning to go to 새벽 기도, and I hated it all my life. But we kept this beloved tradition for decades. That's strength. We survived the war, colonization, and racism. That's strength. Oh my goodness, I did not intend to cry at all for this lecture. And we struck together, more importantly, not just as individual Christians, but as a community of believers. And that is why we have such a strong identity of kinship and identity. Next slide. But at the same time, the flip side of Korea's strong sense of kinship and belonging is the potential to be isolationist and closed off. So I'm going to read this quote from Emil Brunner, one of my favorite quotes. "The church exists by mission, just as fire exists by burning." Have you heard of the phrase missional church? It's kind of not popular anymore, but it used to be a big fad a couple of years ago, and that phrase always made me cringe. It's like saying missional church is like saying a female woman or a four-cornered rectangle, because by definition the church is missional. It's grammatically redundant, right? So having that strong sense of kinship and extending that to our neighbors is our sense of mission. And so let's stop saying missional church, because we are, by definition, the church is to be missional. So next slide, I'm going to end with my favorite mission passage from the Bible, which is John 20. So a lot of people think my favorite passage is the Great Commission because I teach mission. They kind of assume that. I mean, I like the Great Commission. It's a great passage. But Jesus gives a lot of specific instructions like go, baptize. But I like John 20 a little bit more because it's not about doing, but it's about being, mission as our being. Jesus says, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you. And with that, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. So just as the Father has sent Jesus Christ, our Savior, we are sent, empowered by the Holy Spirit, to the world to love, peace, justice, and to love unconditionally. So I would like to encourage us and invite us to craft our unique theology of belonging, agency, and liberation, and at the same time to extend that sense of inclusivity and woodiness to our neighbors who look different from us, who are different from us, come from different classes. To have that sense of love, that unconditional love that knows bounds, just as our Jesus Christ demonstrated. Thank you.
So this is the time for our question and answer sessions. There will be a microphone on a stand that Pastor Chung is setting up right now. So if you'd like to ask your question or have a comment for Dr. Chung, please line up behind the microphone. And we also will be running 2 separate mics. If you are unable to walk to the center of the aisle, please raise your hand. And Pastors Lee and Chung will be bringing a mic for you to use. And when you do give your question or comment, please be considerate and keep it to 2 minutes under. Thank you so much. And thank you again to Dr. Soojin Chung.
Hi, Soojin. David here, your colleague at Princeton. Thank you for your brilliant lecture. I learned so much from your lecture, and I really do look forward to its publication because I know you've been working on this project for such a long time. It was profound because of your personal story and of your commitment to the Korean church. I have a 2-parter. So, do you think that Koreans come to America with a racial consciousness? So that's the first part. I'm curious because you seem to indicate yes. Second part is, later on you were quite explicit in your critique of Korean churches as isolationist. So to kind of put a fine point on it, to provoke conversation for these 2 days, do you think ethnic churches are racist churches?
Why do you have to do that, David? Why do you have to give me the hard question from the beginning? So the first question was, do you think Korean migrants came with racial consciousness? I think we're not trained. So I went to a Korean high school. So I did most of my school system in Korea. We don't learn about these things. We don't learn about racial diversity or how to equip. We are not equipped at all. So in that sense, I don't think Korean immigrants who came with this understanding of race as we understand race in the United States, and how we dissect race. But as I said in my historical analysis, they inherited this Christian imperial racial order very much so from the Western world, and they categorized. And even though Koreans are not that racist, we know that we're not supposed to say, oh, there's a hierarchy. We know that we're not supposed to say that, but it's internalized unconsciously, right? It's internalized because that stayed with us And Korea, we didn't have chance to practice diversity. We didn't have chance to practice inclusivity. So in that regard, it's a yes and no answer. The second answer, are Korean, so ethnic churches racist? No, I don't think ethnic churches are racist. I don't think there is anything that is inherently bad, but anything can go evil, right? So any ethnic church who is founded on their language and culture, that is a good thing, because as we just saw, our triune God very much supports what? Cultures, and there's a reason why Jesus Christ was born in a very specific Jewish context, right? There's a reason why he came in a flesh. There's a reason why Jesus Christ had culture, right? And in the same way, culture matters. So ethnic churches, if they're able to communicate with their own tongue and celebrate, sing hymnals like 만세반석, and to experience God in a profound, deeper way, I think it's a great blessing. But at the same time, if we just remain in that circle, as I was trying to say, that's a problem, right? So the ethnic church itself is not a problem. It's sin that is problem. God is going to use us for his glory, but the devil is always going to tempt us to go the wrong way. So even when we're here with the good intention of trying to praise together and to celebrate Korean and ethnic culture, if we just remain in ourselves, and just if the devil is trying to use that against us, we are going to be isolationist, and we are going to be eventually racist. So I want to, including myself, invite us to have that sense of very strong uriness within us, but at the same time be able to extend that uriness to others as well.
Dr. Chung, thank you so much for your lecture. There was something about what you were saying that I can't quite put my finger on it yet, but made me wonder if you would talk a little bit about then sort of Korean sort of ties, Korean theological ties to Christian Zionism, and how you might sort of think about that. Because it seems to me that sort of what you were laying out makes me think that Korean Christianity in particular is maybe exceptionally susceptible to Christian Zionism, and there's this incredible tie to the point that I think some of our Middle Eastern siblings are saying Korean Christians need to do that work of unentangling themselves from Christian Zionism, and so I would wonder what you thought about that.
Thank you for that question. And some of the dark side of what I mentioned is that Korean nationalism, although it did give a sense of purpose and belonging, and it was a fuel of liberation, there is a dark side of fusing Korean nationalism with Christianity. I don't know if you saw the news a couple years back, but I saw this news article, I think it was a Christian newspaper, where it's a Korean church, and they were worshiping Park Chung-hee. And they were worshiping Lee Seung-man. Like Park Chung-hee is like way later, 1970s, but not like God, but they were saying like because of everything they've done, we are able to have. So nationalism, fusing nationalism and Christianity always comes with this risk. As we see the Christian nationalism worldwide, not just the United States is at the forefront of promoting this nationalistic Christianity, right? But if we look at Brazil, the same thing is happening with the conservative nationalist population and fusing that with Christianity. So nationalism is a very, very touchy subject. So I wanted to kind of distinguish that with the historic Korean nationalism, because it wasn't used in that sense. But in later years, that was interpreted in a very twisted way to almost worshiping Lee Seung-man or etc. So I wanted to kind of throw that out there. And because of that, we are susceptible to anything nationalistic, right? So, and I'm pretty sure, Reverend, that you know that Koreans and Chinese as well actually are very much in tune with and in conversation with Zionist movement. And I think part of the reason is because we relate so much deeply with this notion of 민족. It is kind of part of our DNA, and I think that could also, as I said before, that in and of itself is not a problem, but if sin enters, that can always be used in a sinful way.
In 2023, we had a symposium. In there, one of our speakers was about the missionaries in Korea, and also talk about the Yanghwajin, Korean cemetery for Western missionaries came, and so they worked so many years to evangelize Korea, right? Now, you said about 3 options we had. We chose third option. So then, how you then reconcile with this work of missionaries so many years, sacrifice they did. So that's something that, so basically we're saying is, okay, that's good, but we chose third option. Is that what you're saying, right?
I think I understand your question. So I used to be a missionary, and I love mission, don't get me wrong. I am, after all, the director of a mission center. However, as I said, at the time, majority of the missionaries were politically in favor, not politically, but ideologically in favor of this notion of civilization. So, and as I mentioned, as I gave as a caveat, there were missionaries who were supporting Korean independence fighters. It wasn't all of them, but that was a minority voice. So when I said Koreans opted for the third option, I wasn't trying to discredit all the sacrifices that the missionaries done for abandoning their countries and coming as foreigners themselves, right? They were also foreigners surviving in a foreign land. So I'm not trying to discredit them, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge some of the detriment that the missionaries did in this land as well, right? So there's always positive, and when I teach mission history, I always try to give both sides of the story. There's these positive things of providing education for the girls for the first time, building medical schools and building medical. Then at the same time, there's dark side of trying to mimic Western style of worship, Western imperialism and all that. So we have to look at both sides of the story. And again, when I said Koreans opted for the third option, I wasn't trying to say they just abandoned all missionary form of Christianity, but they tried to have their own voice when the missionaries try to silence them.
Thank you again for the lecture. My question was kind of like, you mentioned something interesting where you said like Korean, especially like Koreans, Korean churches are not yet ready for like diversity in these type of things. And that made me question, like, what role, especially in America, do Korean Americans play, especially Korean American leaders, whether if they continue to serve in these Korean immigrant churches or whether they should expand, like just what role could they play in trying to try to accept that diversity and unity in terms of church practicality?
That's an excellent question, which deserves a 1-hour panel discussion. But I always loved Korean immigrant churches, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit tomorrow. I have a special heart for Korean churches, and I believe in intergenerational worship, and Korean Americans definitely do have a place within the Korean immigrant churches. And in that regard, I do think Korean Americans are very uniquely positioned because they do know how to speak the language of race. They are taught, at least in California or even in New Jersey or Massachusetts, we are taught those like critical race theory or whatnot, sociology of how to understand and how to be inclusive. All of those things, we Korean Americans are equipped and we are taught that from a young age. So in that regard, Korean Americans are different from our grandfathers who migrated after 1965 or even after that. So in that regard, I think there should be a lot of intergenerational, difficult conversations. And I am very blessed with parents who are not very inclusive, and they're very open in their thoughts. But as I shared, my grandparents were uber racist. And I think my parents went to the other side of the pendulum because they saw how racist their parents were, and they wanted a different path. So I think having the difficult conversations, not just within the church, but within the families, the intergenerational conversations are so, so important. So I appreciate your question.
Thank you for sharing. I have a question from the bridging your question 1 and 2. I think in responding to the first question, you were saying by choosing the third options, Korea as a nation, we resisted the Japanese and Western imperialism and the ethnical hierarchy. And having that spirit within the nation, in your study and research, was there no resist towards two Korean educators who learned social Darwinism in America, trying to re-import that idea back to Korea?
You mean Korean Christians resisting that idea?
Right.
Yes, that's an excellent question, and as a historian, I do my best to do the archival research, but from my findings, there was none. So it sounds as if what what Yoo Il-jun and Yoon Chiu introduced was just accepted as a fact. Nobody thought to debate against it. Nobody wrote words against it. Even Seo Jae-pil or An Chang-ho, again, are very beloved freedom fighters. Even though they weren't overtly racist in their writings, like calling natives Reds or things like that, as Yoon Chiu and Yoo Il-jun did, the social Darwinism and this racial hierarchy that Yoon Chiu and Yoo Il-jun introduced was just treated as facts. Seo Jae-pil and An Chang-ho, it was like sky is blue or the mountain is green. It was just accepted as a fact. So I don't think, and if I do find something, I think that will be a gem, and I will definitely let you know, but I haven't found anything, and I think during that time it was just normalized.
It's hard to as I'm an introverted person, it's hard to come up to say something, but I'm doing my best. First of all, thanks for your heartfelt lecture. And then I was born and raised in South Korea in my whole life, and then it's been less than 3 years since I moved to Boston. But I'm still finding myself hard to embrace kind of racial diversity, even though I'm studying at Boston University School of Theology, where the diverse race gather and study. So for those who are struggling with kind of this racial ignorance, what would you give some advice to deconstruct my racial ignorance? This is my first one. And second one, I was wondering if there any like collaborative work between Korean American scholars, theologians, and Korean scholars, because as you said, I couldn't agree more with you are saying that like Korean, maybe they not prepared to embrace or accept other immigrant or people, particularly Southern Asian people. So how Korean or like scholars they can collaborate to deconstruct kind of this racial ignorance, even in Korea, not in the United States? Yeah, that's my second one.
That's a great question, and as a fellow introvert, I feel your pain. It's painful standing up here. That's a great question, and Korean studies, which is part of area studies, and even the field of world Christianity, and Korean American studies or Asian American studies, they're infamous for not talking to each other. And my good friend, Dr. David Chow, I'm sure you and I can lament together that Korean scholars and Korean American scholars or world Christianity scholars and ethnic studies scholars do not talk to each other. So I don't know if there's any work that they did collaboratively. I know that my colleague at Emory, Helen Jin Kim, she tries to fuse Korean studies and Korean American studies and try to talk about race. Her book is literally titled Race for Revival. And that word race can denote two things. Race as in like you're racing towards something, and race as in injong. So you should read that book. That should be your first step, to go read Helen Jin Kim's book, Race for Revival. And the fact that you asked that question is, I think it's a really good starting point. Like acknowledging the fact that, oh, I think I am a little less trained in this area. The fact that you're acknowledging that so humbly, I think is a really good sign, because most people who are actually racist don't think like that. So I think the fact that you're asking those questions and the fact that you're at BU School of Theology of all places, I think you'll learn a lot, and it's going to broaden and it's going to stretch you a lot. And to be honest, even when I was at BU School of Theology, because I went to a very conservative seminary, it was a little bit of a struggle, but I am so thankful for my experience at BU, because it really opened my eyes and it really broadened my heart to be more inclusive and to be more loving towards people who are different from me, who are people who think different, people who believe different from me. So I think that it takes a lot of practice, like our muscles, it takes a lot of practice. And the fact that you're willing to do and put in that work, I think that's more than half of the start.
Hi, my name is Amy. Thank you so much, Dr. Chung, for your lecture today. I am a student at Gordon Conwell, a youth director at a local Korean church in Massachusetts, and also serving the regional youth ministry in New England called Arise. And I just had so many thoughts, like stringing on from are ethnic churches like Korean churches then racist? Are we being missional? Having grown up in Korean church, I think Korean church has been a place where like the first gens have found their like place of comfort and worship. And also second gens and third gens, I'm continuously seeing the need for a space where they can gather with people they look alike to and the culture that they share. But I am also, on the back of my mind, always thinking, how can we be more missional? And in line with that, as I'm like leading and teaching the next generation, what do you think are some strengths in the Korean theology and the Korean American theology that doesn't just make us isolationists, but that mobilize us to be missional?
I love that question. And I love Arise Ministries. I worked with Sage very closely when I was at Gordon. What was the question? Oh, how can we, what are some of the strengths that we can give to our youth and to teach? What are some of the strengths of Korean American churches? I think Koreans are very good at, as we examine, we are survivals, right? And we have crafted this unique theology of belonging. And I think Asian Americans, not just Koreans, have this sense of marginality. And if you're interested, check out Chung Young Lee's book called Marginality, where he talks about Jesus, just like Jesus, who was part of the margin, we are also in this in-between state. And in that marginality, Jesus comes and meets us very intimately. Kind of like the burning bush narrative where Moses is asked to take off his shoes and to go into that sacred space. That is a very awkward, marginal space for him, right? So even then, when he was asking for God's name, he said, I am who I am. And even in that space, God is giving a very flexible name, and he is placing himself intentionally in a very marginal place. So in that regard, Koreans or Asian Americans in general have this unique understanding of marginality. And Christianity is all about marginality, right? And Jesus Christ himself was at the very margin. So in that regard, I think we have a lot to share with the dominant culture that celebrates dominance, power, and imperialism. We can be the light by showing, look, actually, this religion of this faith that Jesus Christ teaches us is all about the marginality, and the last shall be first and the first shall be last. So I think in that regard, that is something that we can teach our youth, to be able to embrace this in-betweenness, even though sometimes growing up, I think most Korean Americans go through that identity crisis at some point. Am I Korean or am I American? Like, where should I belong? But that experience can actually be a incredible strength to understand this marginality within Christianity and the message of the gospel. So I think in that regard, you're tasked with a lot of good works at Arise, and I will be remembering you and praying for you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chung, and we can continue the discussion further during tomorrow's and Wednesday's small group as well as Q&A times. Right now, I would like to invite Reverend Joshua Park to come up and introduce our special speaker, the Reverend Ji-hyun Oh, the State Clerk of the General Assembly and Executive Director of the Presbyterian Life and Witness.
Good evening. Hello. Very, very good to see you. 오늘 저녁 이렇게 다시 많은 분들 또 뵙게 되는데 너무나 반갑습니다. 또 처음 뵙는 분들은 또한 다시 한번 되게 만나서 반갑고 저의 기쁨이라고 나누고 싶습니다. This evening I am thrilled to introduce your next speaker because she is not only the State Clerk of the General Assembly and the Executive Director of Presbyterian Life and Witness, but she's also, because she's the first Korean American to serve the denomination's highest office, only the second woman, and the first woman of color elected to lead our church, PCUSA, in its 300 plus years. And personally, I have to say, I have worked with many people, many individuals, many pastors, many leaders. But just really thoroughly, she has many times surprised and really just brought some, I have to say, some kind of a very excitement after having such a deep conversation with her. And because of that, I have to say that her questions are deeply thought-provoking, right? Because whenever we engage in some kind of conversation, she always challenges me to ask more question, deeper question, even when I feel like maybe no more question. But no, there can be more questions. And it has always allowed me to have a deeper insight. And she's the leader that has been allowing me to have this spiritual discipline. So that's been exciting. Also, her insights are deeply prophetic, and her wisdom and message have been courageous and challenging and very much needed. So it is my joy to introduce you to your next guest speaker, Reverend Ji-hyun Oh. Can we clap our hands?
Good evening, everyone. I always get a little nervous when I get introduced because I feel like people are overselling me. So I just want to say I'm really thankful to be here with you tonight, and I'm so honored and humbled to be a guest speaker for a little bit. I am not an academic, and so the things that I'm going to say do not have like tons of research and sort of backing it up. It's really more of my wonderings and my hopes for the Korean church. I'm really grateful for the symposium and the scholars and the leaders who are making and holding spaces for really important conversations like this, and space for imagination and noticing and discerning what new thing God is doing in the world and in the church among us. Big thanks to the planning team and the Korean Church of Boston for this ongoing conversation that you started several years ago and continuing this conversation. So Today's remarks I make as someone who is a 1.5 generation Korean American who grew up in Seoul part of the time and in the suburbs of Kansas City, Kansas. My earliest memories of church are from the New York, New Jersey area and of me dangling my legs on a very large chair in the hallway of a church waiting for my mom to pick up my baby brother from the nursery so we could go back home. My next memories of church are from Seoul, where I walked myself to church every week with my yellow half-moon church bag filled with a little red children's hymnal, and of me singing in the choir every week. A sanctuary filled with hundreds of little children and teachers and pastors. Both the church in Korea and the Korean American church have been important in my formation and vocation, and it is a space in which I knew I could also never live out my call as my full self in the ways that I felt called, and the broader church confirmed that I had been called. And so the Korean church, while I love it, it has also been a hard place for me because it's a both and. It's a very formational place, and it's a place that has not always welcomed the ministry of people who are embodied like me. So I'm really grateful for this conversation about imagining a new way forward. One of my favorite scripture passages is Romans 12, 1 through 2. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, on the basis of God's mercy, to present yourselves as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your reasonable act of worship. Do not be conformed to this age, but be transformed by the renewing of the mind, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. And I believe that this transformation and this renewal includes habits of thought and habits of being that are culturally conditioned for us, all of us. But in particular in the Korean church, there are some ways in which our culture has conditioned us to think and behave. And so I want to name a few things that I've been wondering about. One of the things that I've been wondering about, and I'm going to pose these as actually sort of like, is it this or is it that? But I'm not saying that those are the only options, but it's really just a sort of a starting place of wondering. I've wondered whether there's an assumption of cultural unity or whether cultural unity is a goal in the Korean church. And I feel like some of the research that Dr. Chung has shared suggests that there might be the sort of goal of cultural unity in that minjok sung that was being cultivated in the church. But I also wonder whether there's also an assumption that we are culturally all the same because we're Korean. When you immigrated, whether that's in the 70s or 80s or 90s, or whether you were born here or you were 1.5 or second or third generation at this point, actually gives your culture and how you live it out some distinctiveness. And whether that flattening of culture actually sometimes gets us into trouble. One of the things that I like about being a 1.5 generation Korean American is the opportunity it gives me to hold both cultures, Korean and American, and to know both well, to compare and contrast, to reflect on the aspects of culture that shape me, and wonder how the good news of Jesus Christ and the ways we live out our faith offers us resources that our cultures may not. One of the things that has struck me is that Korean ways of thinking sometimes resonate in part with Platonic thought, in the sense that there is this sense of ideal, the greatest good. While this plays out in the US majority culture context as ideal versus reality and general acceptance, I think that maybe reality may never meet the ideal. I've often found that in the Korean cultural context, striving for the ideal and never meeting the ideal produces the good of constant effort towards reaching that ideal, and it also often produces a sense of shame toward self or judgment toward others for falling short. So this sense of ideal, again, on one hand, it perhaps also paired with the Korean Protestant work ethic that Dr. Chung mentioned. It gives Korean Christians a sort of discipline that leads to dawn prayer services and early Sunday worship for those who have businesses to run, even on Sunday, that they make that effort on a really, really long day. And it leads to a focus on discipleship and sanctification and deep dedication to church and the practices of faith. I love that about Korean Christians. And on the other hand, I wonder whether it doesn't also contribute to a sense of uniformity sometimes in thinking about Christian practice and an assumption of unity as Koreans. And what I hope for the Korean American church is liberation from thinking there is the one right way to do church or the one right way to staff, that every single church must have a particular sort of looking youth group or a youth 전도사 or a particular program, or the one ideal way to be a faith community or a Christian disciple, for transformation and renewal to open a way forward for amazing new ministries and amazing witnesses to the love and justice of Jesus Christ. Another place of cultural resonance, I think, is as I've been spending a lot of time in Atlanta. I lived in Atlanta for almost 20 years, between Southern culture and Asian culture, and I think also Korean culture, is the managing externals, or cheomyeon, saving face, building face, not losing face. Southerners do this a lot too. And I wonder if that sometimes gets in the way of the ability to recognize and truly see one another in a communitas sort of way. That sometimes the labels of 장로님 and 집사님 and 목사님 and 사모님 and keeping all of that straight. So one time I actually got yelled at by a 사모님 because I said 장로님, thinking that that was actually me, like giving her the highest title that I could think of. And she got very mad at me and said, I am 사모님, not 장로님. And I was like, oh, I'm so sorry. But I wonder sometimes all of those things, if it really keeps us from seeing one another as fully human beings together and building that deep sense of relationship and of being known past those titles, past the places. And there's a particular Korean thing that we do when we're speaking Korean, and even when we're not. What year were you born? How are we related to one another? Upper, lower, side by side? And the language shapes that too. And I wonder what practices might exist for us to be able to truly relate and know one another, that deepens community, that makes people point to us and say, see how they loved one another. We want to be a part of that. The second thing I've been wondering about is theological inquiry or theological policing. I've often sat with people who say something like, given that Korean Christianity is now over a century old, we should have a notable theologian. Why don't we? So first, I want to ask, what makes a theologian notable? Because I think there are many people who are doing amazing theological work, contextual theological work, and academic theological work, and all sorts of other things. But also because of the one ideal, I think, and the fear of sin and error, I wonder if Korean church is quicker than most to label something as a cult or a heresy. In case in point, last year when I was with the Presbyterian Church in Korea at their assembly, they had an overture on their docket that was actually about labeling a particular theology a heresy. And they debated long hours on that. And I wonder about the ability to ask why and question assumptions, and how that can be cultivated in the context of a church. Because those questions, the ability to ask better questions, to ask questions that sometimes get at the foundational assumptions, I think is important to the task of theology. And when this is not allowed, I think we can only parrot or rephrase somebody else's theology, not develop our own. Doing the question asking can feel destabilizing. And I've wondered whether, given the history of war and occupation and immigration and migration and all the generational trauma and the Han that is so often present in our midst, that destabilizing feels extra dangerous. And then that surety of knowing who we are and that stability of knowing what we believe actually has offered us a center and a groundedness. But I also believe, and I hope you do too, I believe that you do, that God has been and continues to do a new thing and calls us to know God in new ways and to follow God into new places and new ways of being and doing and sharing the good news of Jesus Christ. And that God is bigger and more than we could ever imagine. So what I hope for the Korean American Church is that there might be more spaces for courageous and hard conversations like this. Places where people can ask why. Places where people can question some of the accepted theology so that we can explore and inquire more, so that we can know God more deeply, and in a very Calvinist move, also know ourselves more deeply and know God more deeply, and that our faith might be deepened. Another thing that I've been wondering is health and wealth versus wholeness. Pastoral care, I think, often in a Korean church setting has been shimbang and prayers for health and wealth, of well-being. And I think this is important for many folks who are coming out of wartime and an economically really depressed situation, looking for a better life for families. And I also think that so many times the healing services that often happen in the church context, I wonder whether they're really healing or whether they're just treating the wounds and managing symptoms. One of the things that we were asked to do in seminary was actually create a ritual for a ritual that did not exist in church. One of the things that I created a ritual for was actually immigration. Trying to enact and embody something that impacted people's lives and wonder about and talk about the wounds that we carry, the trauma that we may still carry, how we actually do the work of healing together communally. I wonder if there are other things that can be pastoral care moments within the church that really address some of the deepest wounds that people carry. And finally, immigrant church or church made up of people with immigration histories is another thing that I've been wondering about. I recall a conversation with a youth group parent. I was a recent seminary graduate at the time and searching for my first call, but in the meantime, I was serving as a youth director of a Korean American church. She approached me one morning and said it was great that I was investing in youth leadership and doing Bible studies, but she wanted to know what I was doing to help her kids get into college. Like ensuring that the youth group activities included volunteer activities that her kids could list on a college application. And at the time, I told her that if that's what she and others believed the job of youth 전도사 was, that they had the wrong person and I was happy to resign right away. And I also asked her why she wasn't asking me more questions about her children's spiritual well-being and growth as a Christian. At the time, I thought this was a culture and values conversation. But now I see that it might have also been a conversation about what church should be. If the church's primary identity is a place that helps people deal with and navigate the complexities and challenges of living as immigrants, and academic success of the children is part of what it means to succeed as an immigrant, then that youth parent's asking me as a youth director to help her kids get into college is asking me to do the thing that the church is supposed to do. And if part of the life of faith for immigrants is really about the church then helping to navigate that, then it could have been an understandable ask, even though I didn't feel that way at the time. And I still probably would respond in a similar way. And I have often found in the churches that I have been to and that I have worked with, that the children's and youth programs have often been services then that are offered to the adults who come to the church. Sometimes more like robust babysitting that also includes some Christian education. And I've often gotten the sense from parents what they most care about is that their children not get into trouble on Friday, because mostly white churches do not do youth group on Friday nights. And the parents want their children to continue on the right path, making good choices through life. But I didn't always get a lot of questions from youth parents about the Christian formation of their children. And Korean churches have been part community center and part faith community, helping Koreans navigate immigrant life. But I think if that's been the primary purpose, it should also not be a surprise that those who do not need the church to do that for them will eventually leave. And I wonder, as immigration from Korea continues to slow down, what Korean churches will be and become, and what their witness to God's love and justice in the world will be. My hope for the Korean church moving forward is that there would be a continuing discernment and a continuing conversation across the generations, across different cultures of Koreans, to wonder together in what new ways God is calling, and in what new ways the good news of Jesus Christ might be spoken and lived out and embodied, that makes people say, I really want to be a part of that, because that is good news for me. Thank you.
Wow, that was, we had today, I'm turning 70 in a few days, so I can say too young but accomplished. One is historian, and the one is a accomplished church leader. It happened to be a woman. So I feel so honored, only man to speak today. Thank you very much. So thank you for today, and I know you're gonna continue tomorrow. And also we have a morning session tomorrow, and so I want full participation of both sessions. It'll be great. Also, we have a wonderful dinner. Pastor Lee, you have anything to say? Oh, take photo? Okay, so you want to take group photo. So I don't need a lot of people here, but try to fit everyone here, take a photo. So let's try.
윤 목사님, 조셉을 저 위로 올리라고, 위로, 천장 위로. 아니야, 위험하지 않아.